All right. It's so awesome to see you all. The lead up to a conference is a little stressful because you don't know if you're throwing a party and like nobody's going to come or anything. But this has been a great day for me. It's really been wonderful. It's been wonderful to see so many of you and to be reminded how wonderful is world history. Yeah. You know, 2 days ago, a Muslim man of South Asian descent from Uganda was nominated as the Democratic candidate for mayor of New York City. And he's got a really interesting story. And some of us have been assigning his dad's articles for like decades. And, you know, I had no idea this kid existed. And then I saw Mamdani, and I was like, how many Mamdanis can there be? And it turns out, and quite a history. And a guy who's not afraid to talk about the history that brought him here, which I find refreshing and interesting. And that made me rewrite the opening to my very brief talk. I really want to talk briefly and then make way for Dr. Christel Temple, who we brought down here to give what I think is just a talk on an incredible subject. I'm so excited. But very briefly, I want to mention another historical figure, not Zoran Mamdani, but somebody totally different. Because the other day I was once again debating my father on whether Winston Churchill is a great man. And it's the most ridiculous topic. We've spent too much time talking about whether Winston Churchill is a great man. And who cares, first of all? But secondly, my dad cares, and my dad cares because he's a Jewish man born in a British colony of descendants of families who escaped the Holocaust. And for him, you know, Winston Churchill represents a guy who stopped the inevitable advance of Nazism. And in talking about Churchill with my dad, I was reminded again that we as historians, including world historians, need to engage the public in reciprocal conversations, and most importantly, to listen and talk to those who live history's consequences and uphold its memories. There's so many people who are dealing with the trauma of history right now. And I predict there will be so many more in the future who are dealing with the legacy of the events we are living through at this moment. And I think about these lessons all the time. Some of you were here this afternoon in this room where we had a discussion about the ways in which the difficulties of this time impact the organization since COVID, affecting whether people want to go to conferences and how many, funding issues and immigration issues and customs issues, believe it or not, stopping people from getting to this conference today. Many of us have been dealing with trying to help those folks. A growing turn back to the nationalist and the authoritarian, away from, it seems, the globalist. I've always loved Pan-Africanism as a global movement and been interested in it, but it, like other global movements, seem to be sapped right now in the face of nationalism. I'm not without hope. I'm not without hope. And so I'm going to try to do one of the few things really briefly that both Mamdani and Churchill are really good at. There's not a lot they do that's the same. But both of them know how to pivot from despair to hope. The Democratic Party believes the only lesson they've learned from Mamdani is you should do it in a short form. I hope they've learned something else as well. Churchill did it in very long speeches. I'll be in the middle. First of all, we fight on. Resistance is a theme of this conference. We're about to hear from Dr. Temple about a great Louisvillian. Still nobody has told me what people from Louisville are called. I've asked 3 people. What is it? Louisvillian, yes. Muhammad Ali, a local who faced intense persecution and fought on to leave a legacy for our world and our country, who didn't give up and who came back. And goddamn did he come back. And I think that that's an important theme. Second, the Executive Council, who are going to be meeting in a very long meeting tomorrow, have been endlessly thinking about building a better future. We've got 2 plenaries coming up, one on teaching, one on research. I'm really excited about those because they're going to answer the question. They're going to begin to answer the question, what does the future look like for research and teaching in world history? And finally, we have a great conference to look forward to next year. Frankly, Louisville has been wonderful to us, but I am excited we'll be going to Seoul, Korea. And that's our first international conference in a couple of years. You should come. I will be chilling while Ruth stresses out as the president. Where's Ruth? Over there. So Ruth, I will offer you what support I can, I promise. Really quick thank yous. Thank you to the folks who organized this conference. Thank you to the folks who are providing us food and drink and audio and visual and things like that, and who run this hotel and work in this hotel and clean the hotel rooms. Thank you to Ruth, our next president, to our secretary, Tanasi, to Eric Nelson, the best team in history, I joke not, our returning program chair, Cynthia Ross, who year after year puts together a hell of a program for us. Our executive director, yeah, we can pause for, I'm going fast, but you know. Our executive director of 2 years, Morgan Lemmer-Weber, and who had to constantly pivot to make this conference happen, not easy, and our council members who will be joining us tomorrow in discussion. Thank you forever to the folks from the University of Louisville. Rebecca Devlin, Rebecca, are you in the room? No, oh, yes, way in the back, as is typical. Rebecca was once my student, I'm just gonna say that. But it seems, that seems patronizing because you are now such a leader in your own right, but I'm very proud of that. And also the chair of the department, Chris Eric, and Eve Poley, our associate conference director from Louisville, and all the folks from Louisville, and the folks from Louisville who have been giving talks today, some incredible talks, and there will be more tomorrow. Congratulations to our prize winners. I'm not announcing them because they will be announced and get their own moment in the sun on Saturday, but we have some incredible prizes this year. And to all of you who are presenting and engaging this year. Let me conclude briefly with a quote, not from Mamdani and not from Churchill, and not even from Muhammad Ali, but from another Louisvillian, civil rights activist, Anne Braden. You'll have the opportunity to learn more about Anne Braden, I hope, tomorrow. She was at least as eloquent as any of these men. Here's what she said, and it gives me pause. In every age, no matter how cruel the oppression carried on by those in power, there have been those who struggled for a different world. I believe this is the genius of humankind, the thing that makes us half divine, the fact that some human beings can envision a world that has never existed. I think for the World History Association, that's an appropriate thought. Now, don't clap, although thank you, Mark, because I want to do the most important thing here, which is to introduce our wonderful keynote speaker, Dr. Christel Temple, Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Black Studies. She's the author of numerous books, including Black Cultural Mythology and Transcendence and the Africana Literary Experience. She writes on diaspora cultural theory and Africana literary theory. The red eye last night was tough on me, sorry. Dr. Temple has a forthcoming collection related to her topic tonight on Muhammad Ali in Africana cultural memory, and she will be speaking to us about micro-Pan-Africanism and Muhammad Ali. Dr. Temple, please.
Good evening. How's everybody doing? All right. Why should I keep my white slave master's name visible and my black ancestors invisible, unknown, and unhonored? Muhammad Ali. Jonathan Eek. The beautiful thing about Ali is that he acted all day long as if he were all along as if he were royalty, that he had a claim to greatness. Ali's daughter, Maryam. He was ahead of people in understanding that there was a connection that went back through slavery to the kings and queens of Africa. And then finally, Ali himself. I'm happy to know about my ancestors so I can give them credit. All right, aren't those beautiful? All right, so thank you so much to Dr. Trevor Getz, to Dr. Ruth Mostern, to Dr. Morgan Limmer-Weber for the invitation and arrangements. It is indeed an honor to share a few words at this year's opening keynote as a speaker. And the Executive Council asked me to speak on the topic of Pan-Africanism and Muhammad Ali, which is such a perfect topic for this year's meeting here in Louisville, Kentucky. So I have visited Louisville, I'm Virginia. Okay, say it again, Louisville. Oh, that's worse than I thought. All right. I have visited Louisville only once. During my early graduate years, I was a member of the Jazz Actors Theater of Richmond, Virginia, and I had the opportunity to travel by bus from Richmond to Louisville with a team of actors who were performing a gospel stage play called Resolutions. I was cast as Sister Backstabber and the church gossip, and we had no time to explore the city that weekend, and I remember White Castle as the only restaurant available on a weekend when everything was closed. But curious anecdotes aside, regarding my next connection to Louisville, I pay respect to the co-editor of my volume, Muhammad Ali in Africana Cultural Memory, Dr. James L. Nazir Conyers. He approached me after several collaborations on critical biography projects. Earlier, he'd invited me to contribute to projects such as the Frederick Douglass Encyclopedia, Malcolm X, an Historical Reader, Charles Hamilton Houston, an interdisciplinary study of civil rights leadership. And for the Ali edited collection, he spoke often about the dynamic work being done here at the Ali Museum and Center in Louisville. But on Monday, January 23rd, 2021, just as COVID-19 was being acknowledged as a national crisis, and just as we were finalizing the introduction, the conclusion, and the preface of Muhammad Ali and Africana Cultural Memory, my dear colleague transitioned, leaving me to finish the final parts of the book on my own. And so I have such gratitude for the World History Association invitation and for the opportunity to add an extended study of Muhammad Ali to my repertoire, and it complements studies I've done on Malcolm X, Paul Robeson, John Henry Clark, and Maria Stewart. And so this brings me to today's address, A Son of the Blood, Micro Pan-Africanism and Muhammad Ali. So my disclaimer is that, let me acknowledge that Ali's persona and generational identities from his youth to his heights as a champion, to his middle-age decline in sport, to his humanitarian priorities, his illness, his shifts in name, religion, geography, his travel, his political orientation, so complicated. I've been working really hard to get this paper down so you can get to dinner, all right? But I don't wish to generalize Ali's identity, but my focus today is to survey a robust sample of evidence that conveys data that we can mine, like digging to a coal mine, that we can mine to help us understand the parts of Ali's identity and worldview that reveal Africanness and Pan-Africanness. And so this is my disclaimer, and I admit my analysis might be a little ambitious, but what are keynotes for, right? All right, so a broad functional definition of Pan-Africanism is simply unity, cooperation, and mutual identification among people of African descent. Yet Pan-Africanism has various definitions and implications for many populations. I'm fortunate to be delivering this address after the publication of Raylan Rabaka's The Rutledge Handbook of Pan-Africanism that came out in 2020. And my bio was dated because the Muhammad Ali book came out in 2022, which is updated our understanding of Pan-Africanism with critical explorations of the most important historic, current subjects, theories, and controversies in Pan-Africanism and the evolution of Black internationalism. This volume really pushes the limits of all that Pan-Africanism can be. Thus, in contemporary scholarship, Pan-Africanism and Black internationalism are intersectional, And in fact, in Rabaka's overview, he acknowledges that from the 18th century through to the 20th century, there have been numerous definitions and expression of what might be termed Pan-Africanism. He says mention should also be made of the fact that what we call Pan-Africanism between 1900 and 1975, by the last quarter of the 20th century and through the first quarter of the 21st century, is frequently dubbed Black internationalism. He also concedes that most Pan-African historians concur that modern Pan-Africanism commenced with the Pan-African Conference of 1900. However, few Pan-Africanist historians or otherwise, he says, have come to consensus regarding exactly what Pan-Africanism is and what it is not, or its exact relationship to 21st century conceptions of Black internationalism. This is great news for me today. I share Rabaka's observation to liberate the path for today's keynote address for us to follow Pan-African's fluidity to allow a new, robust, Muhammad Ali-centered approach to Pan-Africanism. But internationalism does relate to Ali's Pan-African potential meaning as well. And so I'm drawn to, and if anyone knows him, correct the name for me. I didn't have time to pull him up on YouTube and find the talk. I'm drawn to Adam Getachu's 2021 essay. Do you know him? How do you pronounce his name? It is Getachew, thank you. 2021 essay on the new Black internationalism that follows W.E.B. Du Bois's logic and his shifts on internationalism. And so Ali's refusal to register for military service had a direct critical link to W.E.B. Du Bois's early closed ranks argument that Black equality would follow once white Americans understood that Black citizens were willing to fight in the military for the U.S. and abroad. And so that's what we get from Getachew. He quotes Aziz Rana, who calls this a national security citizenship. But Du Bois shifted away from this angle, instead using Pan-African congresses, advocacy with the United Nations, having an affiliation with the so-called darker nations to give the African American an identity and status a greater international range. And so in fact, 6 years before Ali was even born, in 1936, Du Bois framed a type of internationalism, and I borrow this from Getachew. And I'm replacing colored with black, so updating that as we do in Africana. If the Black world wants to meet the white world on a plane of real equality and effective brotherhood, then first of all, the Black world must be a strong world, strong in its own inner organization, strong in its power of thought and defense. And so Getachew observes that Du Bois sought to build this strength by reframing the American color line as part of the part and parcel of a global pattern of colonial and racial hierarchy. If African Americans could see themselves as part of this larger group of oppressed people, they might be able to develop shared political analyses and strategies. And so Getachew's concise overview of internationalism does not reference Muhammad Ali. Yet, in a layered discussion of citizenship, of global racial hierarchies, Black power, and cultural defense, we can actually see commonalities in Du Bois's mid-20th century worldview. And again, this is just one iteration of Black internationalism. And so I'm also drawn to Sean Jacobs' essay, Get Used to Me, Muhammad Ali and the Paradoxes of World Solidarity, from the Radical History Review in 2018. He offers Jacobs offers a comprehensive overview of Ali's internationalism. And so here it is. I've agreed to speak on Pan-Africanism and Ali, and I cannot find any existing sources on Ali and Pan-Africanism, but this intersectional with internationalism, and so that's where we're going here. Jacobs offers a comprehensive overview of Ali's internationalism. He notes that by focusing on internationalism, he's looking at Ali's relationship to the African continent. He highlights the tensions and energies that defined Ali's political engagements outside of the U.S., and he says, the takeaway is that Ali's actions were at times principled and progressive, or at other times opportunistic and or conservative. He asserts that the larger point is to show how Ali's actions personified paradoxes and complications of what he calls third world solidarity, what he calls racial nationalism, which that I would say Pan-Africanism instead of racial nationalism, but these are good concepts. We'll unpack those in a minute, and post-colonial politics. And so he looks at these 5 ways of Ali visiting Africa, the last one being going to South Africa to visit Nelson Mandela. The one before that was when he was contemplating going to South Africa, and then his early trips from 64 and 74, and also his going as kind of cultural ambassador, perhaps to the United States. That's open to interpretation. Okay, so Jacob's focus on internationalism includes brief references to Pan-Africanism and links Ali's journey to that of other African Americans who returned to Africa and eventually gained a level of political maturity to navigate the nuances of African politics on the ground. I remember Amiri Baraka and other black nationalists saying this all the time. Look, if you're going to Africa, you need to at least study the politics so you know on which side you should be on, and so to know the parameters of the argument. Jacob cites Russell Rickford, who suggests that these returning African Americans eventually rethought the basis of their connection to Africans, moving away from racial mysticism, that's not a word I use either, but I understand what he means, and thoroughly Western essentialism, and moving towards solidarity based on common circumstances and political perspectives or objectives. He concludes, in his later years, Muhammad Ali appeared to have undergone a similar, though not linear, journey. And so Jacobs uses the language connection to Africa, and again, this is still, in my contention for today, only half of the way to a more holistic possibility of what Pan-Africanism is at home and abroad. So in general, Pan-Africanism appears as, and this is where I take license, because it appears as an ideology, it can appear as beliefs, even feelings, and that's what I want to drive home, if you allow me to be rather practical about what Pan-African can be, and as also as in a retrospective of looking at Muhammad Ali. So I suspect and contend that there are way more basic identity-related elements in the African American worldview that prompt African Americans not just to connect, but to identify with Africa, to visit Africa, and to expand and develop a global and historical genealogical satisfaction. What I'd like to do is strike a balance between the more obvious academic history of the tensions, the contradictions, and the complexities of the broad topic of Pan-Africanism and Muhammad Ali in favor of a more personal, cultural, social, public, checking all the boxes, public history approach that uncovers or allows us at least to meditate on this topic from a human interest point of view, one that parallels the reasons why the average African-American layperson might visit an African country, or why they might visit a museum or cultural center, or even visit a city like Louisville to learn about a man, an African-American man, and African in America, Muhammad Ali. So partly I approach the topic from the vantage point of cultural storytelling about the world and our place in it, and this reveals that there is a level of intrigue. There are curiosity prompts about Ali's worldview that allow us to pay less disruptive attention to any potential shortcomings he might have had being thrust into the role of global ambassador, as Jacob implies, and then of him being less aware of international politics as some people would prefer. We're not even going to bother with that. But I want to take a local organic view of Black internationalism from an African American perspective. So for a moment, and in a more autoethnographic direction, as introduction, if you will, there's an additional local and organic African American view of the meaning of Pan-Africanism and Black internationalism. Let me offer a few anecdotes. In the African American community, there are several examples of our unique cultural view of the world and world history that also relate to Muhammad Ali's Pan-Africanism. Number one, the first one is most African Americans who have viewed the miniseries Roots have a story about their experience and about how the film had both personal and cultural meaning for them. I've even heard a story about a Black girl, a white girl, the N-word, and a clog. Fight. Black people were battling, going to school the next days, but the film had a different impact on African Americans. The culture watched Roots and said to themselves, "Oh, look, those are my ancestors." We looked at it and we said, "Well, Albie, that explains a few things." And so I watched Roots when I was 10 years old, And while viewing the graphic Kunta Kinte Toby whipping scene, do you know which one I'm talking about? And in that moment, is he African? Is he African American? Is he African America? They're trying to force a name change on him. I was hiccup crying. I was shocked, 10 years old. I was hurt. I was drawn in, but I could not look away. I was oddly content with the impact that this spectacle, this African American rite of passage, was having on my worldview. And so the busing the busing across town to the black school, the Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud record, little 45 that we had inherited from the adults, and we played over and over again on our kiddie record player. The stories my dad, a truck driver, and my mom, a stay-at-home mom for a while, shared about racism at work and racism during their childhoods, they all made sense. And watching Roots was the first time that I had learned that African American citizens actually came from another part of the world. We take that for granted, especially, I'm not gonna tell you how old I am, but we came from another part of the world, from Africa. And so in this moment, geographically speaking, I began consciously mapping my culture's worldview transcontinentally and even more transgenerationally. Our geography now included not only Virginia, where my dad was from, not only Charleston, South Carolina, where my mother's people were from, but also the continent of Africa. And then granted, there were generations who came before me, I'm thinking like Maya Angelou, older, more traveled, more middle class, more educated folks who did not need a mini-series to introduce them to their heritage, but I was 10 years old and social studies had not yet reached topics of enslavement or civil rights. And so the second topic, we're just gonna add these up. The second one is the topic of the African American worldview is based on the Akan philosophy of Sankofa. Studies have shown that the concepts of return back to Africa, the motherland, the homeland, and now roughly since the 1990s, the Akan concept of Sankofa from the Adinkra system has had a fascinating and ever-expanding usage among diaspora people to convey cultural origin and cultural awareness. So Sankofa means return, it means go back and fetch it. It means it is not taboo to go back and retrieve that which was lost. And in the United States and other parts of the diaspora, namely Canada and the UK, Sankofa has appeared as a philosophy that links us to an African heritage, and we have been using it to name and represent our restaurants, our cafes, our salons, our community development programs, theorizations, educational programs, scholarships, community centers, and more. Plus, the Adinkra system has dozens of other variables. I'm talking about, depending on the chart, depending on who you ask, some have 60, some have 80, some have 112, and you can combine them to make multiple iterations. And the black world is attentive to Sankofa, Je Name a little bit, that means only God, and maybe one or two more, but we're chiseling down the list of these. We're checking them off. And so, why is this? This is because we know that as African Americans, from a world history lens, we are also Africans in America. And one of my favorite Ghanaian writers, Ikwe Arma, says this wonderfully in his novel Osiris Rising. He has an African American woman, an Egyptologist with a PhD, tell her African boyfriend, who she's joined in West Africa to fight for the revolution, and he's clowning her about Africanness, like a hierarchy. She says, look here. Aikwe Arma, a Ghanaian, writes these words for an African-American woman. She says, I choose not to forget a common heritage of thousands of years just because of a few centuries of separation. And so now we get these global timelines, and we get to choose as cultures how are we going to use those or interpret those. So third point is, let's consider this. In the African American community, there's this expression that we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. Anybody ever heard that? Our ancestors' wildest dreams. And so I ask, of which ancestors do we speak? The Virginian ones, the South Carolinian ones, the African ones? And so classified as first generation, I had non-college educated working class parents and a father who said that all my children are going to go to college so that you can choose the job you want instead of having to accept when somebody decides to give them. And I took this seriously, but also we're looking at a genealogy where my dad's father had an 8th grade education, where his father before him was a farmer, honest work, and then his my grandfather's grandfather, which I found out latently, was Joseph Trammell, who built a 10 secrets, say that's how I'm dating myself, Altoids box to put his freedom papers in. And when I visited the NEMAC, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I was like, oh, Trammell, that's our family name. He must be a relative, but came back later. And so if Joseph Trammell in 1852 to 1865, when he had to recertify his freedom papers every year, if he was the embodiment of his ancestors' wildest dreams, meaning he's free, what is the cultural identity of those ancestors? And so was he the wildest dream of his, as you call favorably, saltwater African parents or grandparents? Did they dream of this during the Middle Passage? Did they dream of this in 1619? And so there's an interesting marker applied to 1619 in Afrocentric work. Malefiketi Asante has taken in his early 1979 Afrocentricity text, he refers to 1619 as beginning again. You've taken everything that our cult Africans were in 1619, you're in a new geography, and now you have to begin again. And so the next one is heritage DNA, and I'm building towards something related to Muhammad Ali. I grew up in Richmond, Henrico, Virginia, and as it turns out, despite having a white German, pure, blue-eyed, blonde-haired grandmother, I am 28.8% Nigerian. And never knew it. I'm almost 30% Igbo. And so if Muhammad Ali had taken an ancestry DNA test, and I'll add the caveat and told us the results of that, but to which region of Africa would he be linked? Would it matter? Is this a feature of Pan-Africanism? I've read about his family's DNA test that reveal a link to a famous ancestor, Archer, I think it's Archer Anderson, I forget the last name, but they talk about Ali being the descendant, an African American who's the descendant of an African American. Do you realize how, to someone who's aware of world history, how bizarre that sounds? That you're an African American descendant of African Americans. And so this is where I'm going with this. And so Maya Angelou traveled to Africa. Marita Golden, W.E. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, Hoyt Fuller, and me. That list could go on, but the question is, why? So back to the roots effect and back to the DNA. In one of my early jobs, they had the policy that as a first-year professor, you were guaranteed summer funding, even if your proposal didn't make the cut. And so upon learning that I was guaranteed research funds around $6,000, I didn't blink twice. I said, I'm going to Africa. And so now I have the money, I have the time, I'm a professor, summers are off, and I was going to meet with Nketia to talk about the funeral dirge. But the question is, why do African Americans go to Africa? Why was there a colonization movement in the African American part? Why was there an immigration movement, Bishop Henry McNeill Turner? Why return? Why back to Africa? And the answer is that it is some sort of home or region of origin. And so right now I've have a chapter in a collection on the Low Country diaspora. I mentioned my mom's people are from Charleston, South Carolina. And in writing that, I am lamenting that the great-grands are gone, but for years we always traveled down south to South Carolina because that is the closest genealogical home, down home, that we have here. And guess what? If travel were easy to the genealogical home that I had across the Atlantic, we'd be going there too. And so I'm working with the fact that Muhammad Ali, in 1964, at age 22 years old, shortly after his Olympic victory, said, I'm going to visit Africa, and this is the sensibility of Pan-Africanism that I would like to dwell. And so I am obsessed right now, I think, with begets. I'm a church girl. And every time it comes up, and it's like, oh, why'd you pick that scripture, somebody, Reverend somebody? We're going on and on and on. But in a very Old Testament biblical way, the begets are important, even if, for the African American experience, if they're missing data, if they have archival gaps. In the African American experience, I don't think we speak enough about the begets, and in an honorable way. There are studies on the imaginary, on speculations of the past that sometimes make heritage feel like such a silly little enterprise for African Americans when we're trying to chisel down something beyond, I'm an African American who's descended from African Americans. There's a bit more to that. And so as if the culture's tendency to put a placeholder in a genealogical spot, waiting for the day that we will actually have the data, the knowledge to reveal the connections that were not recorded during enslavement, and as if these are not valid. So this is another direction that the theme of Pan-Africanism and Muhammad Ali has taken me. And so one of the first sources I encountered, and that's where the photo is from, in the traditional route to explore the theme of Pan-Africanism and Muhammad Ali, was the BBC's excellent photographic essay on Ali's travels to Africa and his experiences with the people, or brethren, in Africa. It's titled, In Pictures, Muhammad Ali's Love Affair with Africa. And that article was from June of 2016, but that's one of his, I don't know if that's his first or third trip, but it's from Nigeria. And so they gathered Ali's impressions and observations about Africa. Ali said, I want to see Africa and meet my brothers and sisters. He said, I'm glad to tell our people that there are more things to be seen in Africa than lions and elephants. They never told us about your beautiful flowers, your magnificent hotels, beautiful houses, beaches, great hospitals, schools, and universities. And so the BBC article concluded, crowds welcomed him with the chant of King of the World. They mined some of Ali's best reactions and observations to show Ali's evolving connection with Africa. And so I see Ali as every man in these vignettes. One example of an African American who began to learn the truth about his place in the larger African family. However, Ali, grandson of enslaved Africans, already had an African family. And this is I'm in Africana Studies, PhD, master's degree, history as well, but an Africana Studies historian, and we say this without flinching. I'm an African. I know what, Giselle Bundchen, she's Brazilian, and what else? German. Giselle Bundchen's German, nobody cares. Nobody's saying, let me see, give me a blood test, give me a cheek swab. You can be 8th, 9th, 10th generation Italian American, not even have an Italian name and say I'm Italian. And people are like, oh, that's awesome. You know, and I can say I'm African, and they're like, what are you talking about? And no. So I'm not giving that up, and that's part of what we're doing here. And so Ali already had an African family right here in the United States. And I wonder how much society is capable of not simply having a monodirectional understanding that African Americans have to go get Africa versus having a more multi-directional understanding that Africa is also in many different places, both at home and abroad. And so this is the basis that I'll eventually explore in an additional theorization of micro-Pan-Africanism as reflected in the title. But let's start a little with the historiography. There are not many studies that address Muhammad Ali's intersection with Pan-Africanism. However, Kenyan historian Ali Mazrui's approach from 2005, writing about Pan-Africanism and intellectuals, is notable and offers important context. I heard an iteration of this, of the Pan-African part of this essay in person. I could not believe my luck. Remember that grant where I get to go to Africa? Back in 2001 in Ghana at the Du Bois Center. And I favor it today, Mazrui's continued articulation of this. I favor it for today because he contextualizes Muhammad Ali as African and in a sense of Africanity. And so he writes, many African American heroes are also African heroes. These include the late Martin Luther King Jr., the boxer Muhammad Ali, the basketball player Michael Jordan, the novelist Toni Morrison, and many African American singers. This is an area of solidarity. I'm attentive to that too. He attributes this to how African Americans have received much more global publicity because they are citizens of a superpower. It is therefore, he writes, been easier for Africans in Africa to know about them. And so Mazrui speaks of American Africans. You all have heard this, right? He speaks of American Africans who are part of the diaspora of colonization and have migrated to the U.S., joining with African Americans in the United States who are part of the diaspora of enslavement. And so, the hyphenation is fascinating because a lot of people in this room are probably European Americans. I'm African American. There's some American Africans. There are Asian Americans. And so the hyphen actually relates to most people, not indigenous cultures in the same way. But Mazrui has the African Americans are part of what he calls the diaspora of enslavement. So the diaspora of colonization for American Africans, and then African Americans, the diaspora of enslavement. So he has an easily digestible presentation of the logic of allowing African Americans to heartily identify as Africans. Again, not that we need permission, but I appreciate his ongoing attention to pondering questions of Pan-Africanism and identity. He distinguishes between Africans of the soil and Africans of the blood, which was beautiful, a gift to find in the research for my title. Mazrui's operational definition of Pan-Africanism is useful as he describes it as a quest for unification of Black people. He presents 3 levels of Pan-Africanism: sub-Saharan, trans-Saharan, and transatlantic, with the transatlantic referring to Pan-Africanism among survivors of the Middle Passage and their descendants. Additionally, he presents Pan-Africanism as a system of ideas that is concerned not only with political economy, but also with African culture, aesthetics, poetry, philosophy, and I'm going to add feelings. How I feel, why I want to go, how I view the continuity of who I am today, and Africa becomes a part of that. He also addresses regional, Pan-African has regional integration and regional unification. And part of this unification in his description is that being fellow victims of white racism and police brutality is an area of solidarity between Africans and African Americans. And he gives the Amadou Diallo example, he was shot in an episode of police brutality. And so I borrow this to pose the possibility, especially the regional unification, to pose the possibility of a U.S. domestic Pan-Africanism, a state-to-state, region-to-region solidarity and unification that's based on the same commonality of having a legacy that necessitated resistance. And so I had to call my buddy, the one who's smarter than I am, and I was like, dude, am I missing something? Like, isn't there a word for that? We're like nation within the nation, solidarity, Black nationalism, yes, but we get to call it Pan-Africanism too, and I'll be calling it micro-Pan-Africanism. And so I think of these cities and the neighborhoods who were in solidarity and mutual identification with Ali. It feels like something more than simply African-American hero dynamics and celebrity. The solidarity wherein Ali was and is an icon is based on his genealogy of being a son of the South in the mid-20th century, who had a very public act of resistance that cost him dearly. He had a public sacrifice that tempered his celebrity, revealing that he was an honorable hero, more aligned with traditional resistance of Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser and Harriet Tubman, rather than a contemporary celebrity hero known for sports, artistry, or wealth. And so he paid his dues, and he had public sacrifices that I don't see in Michael Jordan in the same way that people keep comparing those two because of their fame and global celebrity. And so this takes me back to my co-edited edition on Muhammad Ali. When the book was compiled and in production, I happened to mention it to a long-retired mentor, the Ghanaian Dr. Willie Lamuse Smith, or Nana Amanyi I. And he says to me, oh my goodness, what have you done in terms of reputation? I was like, what do you mean? He says, there's nothing new to write on Muhammad Ali, is there? His question came way too late because the book was in production, but I want to share with you the rationale. The rationale that we gave in this collection, and I'm just going to read this quick introduction that I wrote. Here it goes. Michael Ezra, author of Muhammad Ali, The Making of an Icon from 2009, titled the book's introduction, Why Another Book on Muhammad Ali? He suggests that Ali is a world record holder, credited with being the one person who has the most books written about him. Johnny Smith highlights the fact that Ali had received little attention from historians, and his legacy in published collections and biographies has been managed mostly by sports journalists and not by academic historians, and these sports journalists have combined Ali to the history of sports. So in a shift that represents the priorities, methodologies, and critical frameworks of the academic discipline of Africana studies, this collection articulates the wonder and scope of Muhammad Ali from a curricular perspective of Africana cultural memory studies, and it reveals how Ali's life and legacy are teachable and quantifiable within the core subject areas of the discipline. Additionally, as an Africana cultural memory study on Ali, This prowess in sport does not overshadow his prowess in living successfully as an admired, racial, strategic, often reinvented, courageous, and culture-loving African-American man who was also an African in America. And so in Africana Studies, there's no conflict for us to talk about these all at the same time. Yes, I was born in Virginia. I love Virginia. Yes, I saw people kissing the ground when I went to Egypt. I heard about it, and I heard about it going to Ghana, but this is important to us because it is ours, even though we don't live Africa in that same way every day, taking 2 trips a year. So we continued in the introduction, whether we focus on his identity as a grandson of enslaved Africans in Louisville, Kentucky, as a member of a thriving Black nationalist religious organization, or as an iconic African-American Parkinson's disease fighter carrying the Olympic torch, he is the progeny of an ingenious African people who practiced surviving in a hostile and racist terrain for hundreds of years in the United States. We don't talk about the sacred in African-American life and culture. We talk about rap, we talk about clothes, we talk about Oprah, we talk about Christel's doing the keynote, all of these things, but I used to go to Virginia Beach, and keep me aware of my time. Virginia Beach every year, still go, and I pick up the sand in my hand and let it trickle down in acknowledgement that that beach is made up of the ground, teeth, and bones of my ancestors. African ancestors, enslavement trade, sharks following the ships, all of that, right? Point Comfort right up the street. And so it's not to say that, oh my gosh, you all are so obsessed with your heritage in Africa and you don't speak an African language. It's that we celebrate the continuity. And I was delayed on my plane out of Atlanta, had a lot of time to think, and I said, you know what, for this keynote, the key concept that I'm left with is gratitude. How about I'm just grateful to African ancestors for surviving? I'm grateful for dreaming about a time when there was freedom, and as a whole being, a whole African American being, I see no conflict in saying, oh, Muhammad Ali from Louisville, Kentucky, an African American, an African American. I just celebrate in one stroke of a greeting. Hi, I'm Christel. And then Christel's happy to be here because she's her ancestors' wildest dreams. It's a beautiful thing, but it adds the sacred to the sacred to the African American experience, and I don't think we do that enough. So here's what I did. I knew that Elias Bongma of Religious Studies at Rice was a friend of James Conyers, Nazir, my co-editor who passed while we were finishing the book. And I said, Professor Bongma, can you write our foreword? He said, I'd be honored to. And so the book is on cultural memory. Yet he says, in part of his foreword, he says, like regarding the rumble in the jungle, he says, like everyone, I nurse the feeling that I wish I were there at the stadium in Kinshasa. For the many Congolese and Africans who followed this international sporting event that pitted 2 sons of the African world on African soil, it was a real big deal, something that had not been repeated on the African continent. So just like me, he's here now from the Cameroon in the United States, and it rolls off our tongue, pitted 2 sons of Africa. And so we don't go to our public schools and be like, hi, Kwame and Hennessy and, these creative names we have. Hey, you're a son of Africa. We need to. And that's part of Africana Studies, because what we're trying to do is to give the whole culture a holistic view of their heritage, of their lineage. Like, I have a friend who visited Ghana. He was getting his PhD at Temple University in Africana Studies some years after I was, and he said, I went to Ghana on the study abroad, and the smallest child walked up to me and said, what is your lineage? And he said, I was floored because I couldn't tell them. Yet, I'm Nigerian. I didn't know this 10 years ago. But what else will I know with the advances in the archive and data mining and everything else, what we discover in the future? And so we can't abandon these questions about what exactly is the full spectrum of our heritage. And that's what I see. Thank you, Trevor, and the Executive Council for sending me in this direction, because my first book was on literary Pan-Africanism. I was like, oh my gosh, look at these West African writers who are writing about African American characters. Oh my gosh, they remember us. And so I follow the trail, such as Ezekiel Mfahele, South African critic and scholar who was in exile in the US, and he said Africans have no psychological need to connect with African Americans. And I'm like, but I'm reading I do. I'm reading Wole Soyinka. I'm reading Aikwe Armah, and they're creating African American characters, so they do have some curiosity. And then when my book on Black cultural mythology came out, mythology is these stories that we just embellish about legendary hyperheroics. I started lecturing on that, and I realized that that was also part of the Pan-Africanist question, or that literary Pan-Africanism was also about memory. Do you remember us? When I come back, like Maya Angelou does in All God's Children Need Traveling Shoes, will you know you? Will you remember me? How do I need to temper and tweak some things so I don't expect Africa to, meet me off the plane? But it is a start, and it's a process. And so one of the scholars I mentioned earlier was really onto something that you can start with a type of romanticism, but then you get fortified, you understand a little more, and we can have these different types of conversations. And so Elias Bongba, wrote about Pan-Africanism when I wanted him to write about cultural memory, but they are intertwined. And so I want to revisit solidarity for a minute. What I mentioned a little while ago, Mazrui describes African familiarity with an affinity for famous and achieving African Americans, such as Muhammad Ali, as solidarity, but solidarity goes deeper than this. Black solidarity is a concept of black nationalism, and that's one of my pet peeves in Africana studies. It's like, people know Pan-Africanism. It's getting hot up here. Can I have my fan, please? I get so amped, it's like, working out, giving my lecture. But thank you. Okay, that's good. That's all I need, too. All right, so in researching my chapter, so in Black nationalism, we forget the parts of it that, nope, that's not where I did that in here. Okay, in researching my chapter on Muhammad Ali, for the for the cultural memory book, I came across Gerald Early's description. He helps to capture Ali's meaning to black boys in particular and to the black community in general. Early says, when he refused the draft, I felt something greater than pride. I felt as though my honor as a black boy had been defended, my honor as a human being. He was the grand knight after all, the dragon slayer. And I felt myself, little inner city boy that I was, his apprentice in the grand imagination and the grand daring. The day that he refused the draft, I cried in my room. I cried for him and for myself, for my future and his, for all our black possibilities. And so I'm really drawn to, I was first going into direction where I said, I'm going to look up the demographics of every black city every city where Ali fought. Then I'm going to make a case for the diaspora is simply culturally significant communities. And so if Louisville was, actually it's kind of high, it's 30% at some times, but I went through every year and looked at the percentage of black people in these regions where Ali fought, but then I learned that the tickets were $100, $250. The $100 ticket is $1,000 of today's money. And I'm like, well, how did black people see the fight? Closed caption TV, parties, but there's an example. I said, let me just explore the Baltimore Afro-American and just start following Muhammad Ali. And this was so beautiful, what I found from 1964. Sterling Page ran an article called Muhammad Ali in Baltimore Finds Everybody Loves Him. Cassius Clay plays Pied Piper. And so we're watching who Ali is to the children. When they had a photograph, it was grainy, so I didn't put it up, but it was men, women, and children. But he says the champ was in town. Word quickly spread around. Boxing's world heavyweight champ Muhammad Ali. He wrote it almost like the boxing guy, the famous one who read things, the announcer, I don't know his name, but was in Baltimore. Kids spotted him, and soon there were hundreds of them following their idol. They swarmed around him, blocked the streets, and stopped traffic. The police came, but not to check the juvenile crime wave, only to open up the lanes for traffic. In East Baltimore, more kids got the word that the champ was in the area, and they rushed out of school to get to him, and others joined them, and before long, the entire block was almost filled with youthful admirers. And so I don't have to drive home the point of how inspiring someone like Ali can be to our youth and to our communities, right? But I also want to do the cultural memory, historical memory tweak, public memory tweak that we've got to see more than African America in Ali. And so my final point is on micro Pan-Africanism. I taught a graduate course on literary Pan-Africanism. That's why I wrote the book, teach a course. But we had a great time. And so at the end, I had a student who wanted to do a study on whether African continental social and gender activists were compelled to protest a highly publicized African-American woman's missing person status and murder that resulted from a dating app-driven encounter. You all may know her name, but I don't talk about the students' research too much. But I was baffled. I was like, how'd you get this out of what I taught all semester? And I said, so I could see if you look at journalistic media, that's the literary part, but the Pan-Africanism part I didn't quite understand. And so to help her out, I brainstormed a way to allow the inquiry to fit in the research guidelines. And I said, well, African Americans are Africans. The local Connecticut town where the tragedy occurred mobilized to assist and support the family. So there's a possibility to operationalize these independent, culturally significant communities, that's the diaspora, right? Or units as a type of micro Pan-Africanism. Now, the joke is I thought I made it up. And I went and checked, and I found some South African references, and I was like, see, you can theorize this. You really have an opportunity to do some groundbreaking theorizations on this. Do you want to go in this direction? But I also saw later that a Time magazine article on this same, tragic death was written by an African woman who, when I looked up her bio, she was born in Virginia to Nigerian parents. So we have an American African writing for Time magazine about an African-American woman, and the community mobilized so fascinatingly. There was, you had the NAACP, you had the lawyer, you had his firm, you had social media, you had churches, you had all these levels, and I'm seeing Muhammad Ali's boxing all these places, everybody loves them. This woman went missing, and all of these units of the black community in solidarity from their African-Americanists to their Africanists are mobilizing, and there's something to that. And so as I searched it, would you believe that the only, well, out of 3 micro Pan-African references, one is to Fela Kuti. He had a Pan-African community, micro Pan-African community made up in the beginning of a lot of those who had been in prison before, and so this safe space. But I found an Austrian scholar's review of Black Panther that said exactly what I wanted to share with you today to reinforce the way that we view black communities as kind of micro Pan-African units. He said the film propagates, his name is Martin Lichtschmitz, and he says the film propagates a blatantly identitarian message, which in itself is positive. Wakanda is a kind of micro Pan-African, essentially ethno-culturally homogeneous nation composed of various tribes, all of which have retained certain peculiarities. Its inhabitants cultivate a passionate patriotism that is never questioned. They live in seclusion behind dense borders and are meticulous about who may enter their country and who may not. And so as a researcher, I checked Ngram, it didn't show up, but I found the concept of micro Pan-African. It's useful, someone else gets it, which is amazing for me. And I am just happy to participate in an organic contribution to new knowledge that I've tried to make inspired by the request to talk about Muhammad Ali and Pan-Africanism. And I think it reminds us to think more broadly about the continuity that surrounds African American identity to the extent that we can identify a US-based diversity of being sons of the blood, but in African American cities and locales. Inevitably, as an Africana historian, I frame my work within the credo of Afrocentric Africana studies. That is, that the work that we do, we are creating knowledge, we're inspiring behaviors that will increase the life chances and life experiences of people of African descent in particular, but of humanity in general. And people forget that part, like, oh, Afrocentric, going back to Afro-Egypt. No. Read what we've said. Our job is to increase the life chances and life experiences of people of African descent in particular, because we're handling this problem of post-colonialism, post-enslavement and everything, but of humanity in general. Humanity is the end game. And so this examination of Pan-Africanism and micro-Pan-Africanism is also a trajectory that celebrates the rights and privileges of all people, all world cultures, to trace back They're our ancestries, our journeys, the depth, the distinctive collective memory, the early nationalisms, and continuous community nationalisms, all as an academic and practical act of gratitude. Thank you very much. Thank you, you all. That was long. Thank you.
No, it wasn't too long. So, thank you very much. I have some questions for you, but as is only polite, I'm going to wait and see who else may have questions first. So I'm going to start with Jonathan. Well, you're close.
I'm close. All right, I want to start out just by saying thank you. And I want to say thank you for making me think about one of my favorite things all the way through this. And that is, one, nationalism in all its positive and in its many, many very negative manifestations. And living as we do in a neoconservative, jingoistic nationalist moment, not just in the United States, but in so many parts of the world. We're not alone in this. What you got me thinking about is what the nation wants. And I've never written it this way, and I'm going to try and get it right. The nation desires its citizens to simplify and subjugate their identity to nationalism. And that the desire of the nation is to impose your national identity and subjugate all your other identities to it. You can be African American, but you got to be American first. You can be Italian American, but you got to be American first. And what you've done is highlight the beauty and the antidote of really complicated and deeply layered and sometimes contradictory identities. And so thank you.
You're welcome.
For that.
I still can't find my definition of nationalism but I teach it all the time. It's in my pages. But Black nationalism was a beautiful thing. In my cultural memory work, I talk about we're celebrating versions of African American patriotism. Do I stand up for the flag? Yes. Do I know the Pledge of Allegiance? Yes. I'm a singer. I can sing the songs, the anthems and things. But they coexist, and there is no contradiction between that for many African Americans. There's no contradiction. And so, when I was early in my career, my grandma, my German grandma, was sitting in the Black church while I did Black History Message. And after a while, she's like, "Oh my God, you don't love me anymore?" And she was serious. And then she was like, "You don't love me anymore? You talk all this Black stuff." And I said, "Grandma," I said, "I love you. I'm named after your best friend, Christel, European spelling. I have German dolls in my stash." I said, "Listen, I'm dealing with the part of the culture that has problems that need to be fixed. I love it all, but this one, like a sick puppy in the litter or whatever," that's not the best analogy, but this needs a little more TLC. And so to say that we can increase the life, be pro-Black, pro-African, it does not mean that you're anti-anything. And the beauty of this is, one time I taught intro, and we were down, we were nitty gritty. We were doing Karinga and Asante, and falsification of African consciousness was Amos Wilson. And I read an evaluation, and an Asian American student said she never got to the Asian part. And it was an Intro to Africana Studies course, but she got drawn in understanding, thank you, what you're seeing a little bit of that I'm trying so hard to convey. She got sucked into that and forgot that the course was Intro to Africana Studies, not Intro to Multicultural Studies. And I cherish that critique for the same reason. And so nationalism, Black nationalism, nation is land. We wanted a land base. I don't know how much we can get that, but we have land. We wanted an economic platform. We wanted the opportunity to have a productive relationship with Africa and African identity. We wanted an economic platform. We wanted a Black God concept. We wanted solidarity and self-determination. And you have this whole list of things, but we do have some of that in these communities. That's why they're home. That's why they're so endeared to us. And that's why, too, that we can acknowledge heritage go back to Africa, go to Ghana, but when I get to my house in Pittsburgh, or definitely Virginia with my parents, South Carolina with my great-grandparents, they're all part of this, this beautiful basket of all of our identities that we can skip through the woods carrying, right? All right, thank you. Back in the question in the back? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Oh,
Yeah, thank you for your wonderful speech. I was going to ask you about the relationship between Pan-Africanism and Black internationalism that you spoke about, because when I think about 20th century, late 19th and 20th century histories of Black internationalism, you know, I think of, like you said, the Pan-African Congresses. I think about the intersections between the African American freedom struggle and decolonization in Africa. You know, the kind of trajectories that Muhammad Ali is developing. But I also think about a whole host of Black internationalisms that are tied to anti-colonial movements that are much more global. You know, so thinking about African American support for the Filipino Revolution in 1898 against American power, you know, thinking about Black internationalism vis-a-vis the Russian Revolution, thinking about Indian anti-colonialism, and the wonderful work of Nico Slate, and sort of talking about the very dynamic intersections between the Black freedom movement in the United States and Indian anti-colonialism. So there are lots of examples, and I'm wondering how you think about the relationship historically between Pan-Africanism and Black internationalism on a global scale.
okay. Thank you for that. And all of these are tremendously important, but I go back to Jonathan Reynolds, is that it? I want scholars in my Africana Studies department who can explore everything you just talked about, and who can do Haiti, and who can look for so the core, my lens, and it's not the only one, I'm excited about the work Keisha Blaine does and calls it Black national internationalism and not Pan-Africanism, because we do need another word sometimes, because people, sometimes they need to be disarmed about Pan-Africanism. But I read a book by Imani Owen. She's at Rutgers, she used to be at Pitt, but she talks about, hey, the Harlem Renaissance had deeper connections than we realize, and she spends a chapter on Eric Walrond, I forgot his tropic, I forgot his title, but he was all over, he was Pan-Caribbean. He had all these experiences from the Panama Canal, and then he brought those into his poetry, and are part of the New Negro movement. And so we're very aware that Claude McKay was from Jamaica, Garvey from here, and I know I'm skipping generations, but you know, Shirley Chisholm from Barbados, that there is a deep connection that people we're calling African Americans are more than just African Americans, and these are parts of the same conversation. But I want to have these, and the dean will not give me enough lines that I can, any deans in here, that I can hire these faculty, and my colleagues don't completely understand it the same way, because you see I'm deep Africana, deep down Africana all day long, but that's the connections I want to have in my department, cross-departmentally. And so when we talk about collaborating and shared lines and things like that, I need my shared line to think like you all do, so that when you come to Africana, we understand that nationalism is not this crazy thing, that Pan-Africanism is not, she's not psycho and essentialist and all of these things, and that we build with this respect for all of these other ones. And so that's my comment on Black nationalism, but I thank you for, we get so much of it on Haiti. But do you realize the babies, the children are growing up not understanding that Black people have always been in the international? I had a dean tell me, Africana Studies is not international. I was like, yes it is, it's always been. Haiti, Negritude, Langston Hughes, just read one of his. Du Bois, what, he said, well, you didn't tell me. I said, well, I'm telling you now. And I was chair, and it's just like, phew, I'm excited about internationalism, and that's why I shared Raylan Mabaka. He says, look, it can be anything, but we know it is something, and it's this core, but it doesn't always mean back to Africa or returns. It means let's map the constellation of the connections that people of African descent have been making all along, and then that allows what? Eventually in 100 years we'll have a better world history textbook because it accounts for all of that. Thank you so much for your question.
So since Wakanda got name dropped, I sort of have to stand up for the comic studies scholars here. I wanted to ask you a question, not meant to be a gotcha at all, but have you ever had a chance to read Muhammad Ali versus Superman, which was a 1970s publication in which the two of them, I mean, like in grand comics tradition, it's not actually verses, it's a team up. But like, how would in an era where Superman is still using the truth, justice, and the American way motto, how would that framing of the two of them as first oppositional and then eventually as allies in a scenario where Superman has lost his powers and that he and Ali are equals, this Old Testament golem-inspired, genetically superior or solar-powered man versus, and then paired with Muhammad Ali as spirit of, or representation of the African world stand up to you? How would you interpret that?
Oh yeah, I've seen it. I saw it at the August Wilson's comic book exhibition, and they wouldn't let me touch it. And people have also talked about it, but this is the beauty of the fluidity of. In Africana Studies, for example, we teach our students that your goal is to be a master communicator with a high cultural competency in areas of history and nationally, the list goes on. High cultural competency, be a master communicator so that something like this doesn't trip us up. In my own research, I looked to the work of psychiatrist Amos Wilson. He's an ancestor, but he wrote a book that I rely on very much for my cultural memory studies, and it's called The Psychological Development of the Black Child. And so he borrows the concept of mythological structure from psychology and then applies it to the black experience. He says, well, and it's written in the 80s, he says, well, imagine a playground. Little boys are playing where they're developing their alpha male possibilities. And they said, let's play superheroes. They're like, I'm gonna be Aquaman. Another one's like, oh, I'm gonna be Spider-Man. Another one's like, oh, I'm gonna be Thor. And then the black kid says, I'm gonna be Superman. And then the white kid said, no, I'm gonna be Superman. And they go back and forth, but how does it get resolved? The white child says, Superman is white, okay? And so we've moved beyond that now because I think the more people know about history, they know about world history, they know that these scenarios have changed, and if humanism is our end game, where we can collaborate and not be mad about the racial, not hit someone in the head or wherever she hit her with the claw because she called you the N-word, where we can settle these complex conversations in this way, that is the end game, that's what we want. And I also would say, how about we go back to John Henry, who was the prototype for these comics in the first place, and so now you've got Muhammad Ali and John Henry squeezing Superman in. And so I think it's amazing to give us these type of conversations that allow us to understand that patriotism's definition is fluid in addition to nationalism, and that the nation within a nation status that what Martin Delany identified or applied to African Americans back in the 1800s, that's a real thing. I don't like double consciousness. That was early in Du Bois's career. People use it too much. Like, I'm not sitting here with two brains. I'm sitting here like someone who speaks 12 languages. And so I can take whatever lens or methodology. Do I need to look at this in a political way, a gendered way, a philosophical way, an aesthetic way, and do all of this with the fluidity, flexibility, dexterity, if you will. And so I think that's what the comic book does there. Thank you so much for that wonderful question.
I want to thank you for what was a really beautiful lecture. I've come from Manchester in the UK, and we held the Pan-African Congress in 1946, and I'm sure if Muhammad was 20 years earlier, he would have been there all day. Just before you mentioned a quote that he said, I want to meet my brothers and sisters in Nigeria, was it, during that trip? So I've done some research for context on Muhammad's trips to Britain over the years, and he made many. And in 1963, during the first Henry Cooper fight, this is where you were, there was one quote where you said something about there's nothing new to write on Muhammad Ali, is there? My response is there can never be enough, because he gave so much to the world that you're always discovering kind of new things that you'd never heard of. So I spoke to a journalist who was working for a newspaper in London, and Ali came in to this central London newspaper, and they were doing promotion. And after the promotion, he said, I want to see the brothers in London. Where are the brothers? And I literally wrote that just before you mentioned that. And so this white journalist, a gentleman called Ray Weaver, said, okay, I can take you down. So there's an area called Brixton in London, which is famous historically, especially after World War II, for the Caribbean community moving there. So Ray Weaver, in a Mini of all cars, took Muhammad down, and the only place he could think of to take him was the pub. So despite knowing that Muhammad was because he was in the process of becoming Muslim by that point, he still took him to the pub, and they spent time with the brothers, as he said. But he went back to Brixton during at least 2 more times. In the 70s, he went back, and he connected with a lot of activists in Britain generally. So there's a gentleman called Paul Stevenson, who led something called the Bristol bus boycott in the 60s or 70s, which was a kind of like labor movement boycott around who could work and who could drive on the buses there. And he returned, and there's all sorts of other stories. So one that I'm going to hopefully talk about later this week at the conference is about a Manchester trip he made in 1971. He'd previously connected with a Nigerian gentleman called Phil Magbotuan, who founded a club called the Reno Nightclub in Manchester as a space to be an inclusive space where there was still a colour bar, basically preventing black and mixed race people from many of the clubs in Manchester at that time. He told him of that club. So they met at a fight in Canada. He told him about his club, and they managed to have dinner and stuff after the fight. And Ali said, "I'll come and visit you." And years later, I'm really fortunate to have spoken to Phil's daughter, Lisa, about this story, and she tells it way better than I could recount. But he just appeared in the nightclub just on a one-off, and someone came and said, "Muhammad Ali's in the club." And you're joking, he's come to my club. And it's just to speak to everything you've been saying in a couple of the earlier questions. You mentioned Africa is many different places, both at home and abroad, and completely spot on. I just wanted to thank you so much. You mentioned that you plotted the demographics of every city that Ali fought in. Could you talk a little bit more about that and some of the things you found from that? Because I find that like a great project.
I found that some of the populations were larger then than they are today. I was looking at the London fight, and it's like, okay, well, nobody's collecting the data. I'm looking at the Berlin, I think, right? I'm like, no one's collecting the data. But I was like, well, I know Barbados. I don't need data on that. But I was trying to do something with that, and my first impulse was to have kind of a data-driven demographic analysis of Ali's meaning. But when you find out black people there's no way to know who was at the fight, who bought tickets, who actually got tickets, but they were economically prohibitive. Those prices were. But so that's all I found. I found numbers, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it. But it was nice to see. More than that, though, in our collection on Muhammad Ali and Africana cultural memory, we have a contributor who wrote about Ali's friendship with the Japanese sumo wrestler. And so she called that a pan-ethnic sensibility. And we also had another scholar, another historian, who wrote about Ali and Cuba, the relationship, the shoulda, coulda, woulda, might-haves with Cuba and possibilities of fighting there, but even more so about Ali's placement in the Afro-Latino community of Miami, and what he learned and who he learned it from. And so there's so many connections. So I agree with you. My mentor is a little traditionalist, but I was like, dude, why do you keep trying to do this to me? But we had already had it written down, why another book on Muhammad Ali? And another question a sports writer said, why are people so intense about the heroes anyway? I forget his name, but I was able to answer that too with the mythology work, the cultural memory work. Thank you so much.
I'm going to ask my question.
Okay.
I've waited long enough.
And I'll be at dinner too, so we can chit-chat.
Right. First, since we brought up comics, I would just say that there is another great comic about Muhammad Ali by an African comic creator. It's being reissued by Catalyst Press right now, actually. Barley Baruti, the great African comic artist, created Chaos in Kinshasa. And, it's got this great Harlem anti-hero in it, but it's about the rumble in the jungle. And I don't know if you know it, but it's
I've heard
great.
that. It sounds familiar.
Yeah, well, they've translated it now, so it's a bit easier on us. But the other thing is, when I once had a conversation with friends in Soweto about how their impressions of America came about, they remember Muhammad Ali visiting Mandela. And so my question for you is, and this is a hard one, my wife and I were also in the Muhammad Ali Museum, as you know, and learning a lot more about him. And what I was wondering is, do you think he saw in Mandela another like African icon, or do you think he saw another, activist for poverty alleviation and things like that, or was it just sort of their shared humanity, or what would he have seen in Mandela that inspired him, I think, to make that particular trip? Because he went all the way down, and it was 1993, and I think he was already sort of tired at that point.
From what I've read of that, I found that they had mutual respect for each other. I think Mandela mentioned something about, I followed you while I was in jail, I was in prison. But more so in my studies I read everything on Ali when I was working on the book and trying to find the gems and the morsels I needed for my work on. My chapter's called Something Greater Than Pride, looking at Africana cultural memory. When you say someone is the GOAT, and I know his wife, what do you call it, copywrote it or something like that in 1992. When you call someone the GOAT and you say you're the GOAT, I found that despite that description, which referred to his boxing matches, Ali had this natural ability to translate that into humanitarianism, but there's a tremendous amount of humility. And so how do, I feel, my feelings again, my Pan-African feelings. I just remember when Maya Angelou was trying to get Malcolm X an audience with Kwame Nkrumah. And then Kwame Nkrumah had an audience with Muhammad Ali. They both got 30 minutes. And so that was kind of the going rate. But our African-American leaders who are visionary, like Ali in his own way, like Malcolm X, they are seeking to build, to extend extend the kind of the web and the constellation of the footprint, if you will, of African Americans, but not in a way of American exceptionalism. And so going to hunt, to seek out Mandela, knowing that, Ali was already aged, Mandela's already aged, and this is a moment for celebration. I think Ali knew that as the GOAT, that he has quite a cachet to kind of put a, not to rubber stamp, but to demonstrate to the world that this is where your heart and your sacredness should lie, where your honor. Remember that quote about honor? He said, ancestors, I would honor them. I think he was doing it to honor him, and that it's one GOAT to another, or maybe Mandela was the GOAT. And so that's what I take from that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Both fighters.
We do have time for one more question, if there's one out. Oh, sorry. Carrie.
Thank you for your wonderful talk, and I'm inspired by my colleague from Manchester. I'm Australian, and I remember, as a very young child, Muhammad Ali coming to Australia. And I was just checking my phone because I thought, in his politics, I wonder what Muhammad Ali did in Australia. And when he was in Melbourne in the late 70s, he connected, he made a point after his fight to connect with Indigenous Australians who were fighting their own political battles for equality at the time. So I think it's really interesting to think of Muhammad Ali's black internationalism as well as his Pan-Africanism in the context of knowing that he was an icon for black people everywhere in the world, including Australia.
And I didn't thank you. I mean, see the wonderful special, edited collection we could have on this. I love the word inheritance, because a lot of times we have received things from our forebears, and it's really a latent realization, like, oh my gosh, and that it's just valuable in terms of memory. But I wonder, and I even went on 23andMe and tried to go down the rabbit hole of Ali's genealogy to gain a sense from that archive if I saw the word African somewhere, or if I could make a case for his great aunts and siblings and grandparents and where they lived and things like that. I haven't found anything yet, but I'm a genealogist. I'll find it. Give me another year. and 4 a.m. nights down the rabbit hole doing genealogy. So thank you for sharing that as well. You all have been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, you've been wonderful. Thank you.